the heart of the gold, and the shadows of the stone. Richard Montgomery stood in his penthouse apartment, coffee growing cold in his hand, staring at the package that had arrived that morning. At 62 years old, he had everything a man could want. A successful career behind him, investments that would sustain him for 3 lifetimes, and a view of the city that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. Yet somehow, he felt like a man standing in an empty room, listening to echoes of a life that had never quite begun. The package bore his late grandfather's seal, an old-fashioned wax stamp that Richard hadn't seen since he was a boy. Elias Montgomery had died 3 months earlier, and the funeral had been a sterile affair of lawyers and distant cousins calculating their inheritances. Richard had expected nothing. His grandfather had already given him everything. The business, the connections, the path to wealth that Richard had followed without question. But this package was different. Inside was a leather journal, worn and cracked with age, its pages yellowed and fragile. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. His grandfather's handwriting, still bold despite the decades that had passed since the ink was laid down, filled the first page. To whomever finds this, it began, I have spent my life building fortunes, but I leave you something far more valuable. Follow the shadows of the stone where the river bends twice, and you'll find what I could not give while living. The journey itself is the gift. Do not travel it alone. E.M. 1952. Richard read the words 3 times, trying to decode their meaning. A treasure? His grandfather had been a practical man, not given to games or riddles. Yet here was a puzzle, left behind like a final test. He thought about calling his attorney, then stopped. Something in those words, do not travel it alone, made him hesitate. Richard realized, with a jolt of recognition, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd truly collaborated with anyone. Business deals, yes. Transactions, certainly. But partnership? Friendship? Those were luxuries he'd somehow forgotten to pursue while building his empire. On the other side of the city, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, where the pipes rattled and the heating worked only intermittently, Maria Reyes was fighting a different kind of battle. She stood at her kitchen sink, washing dishes from breakfast, while mentally calculating whether she could afford to buy her children new shoes this month, or if they could make do with what they had for another few weeks. Sophia needed notebooks for school. Miguel's jacket was getting too small. The electricity bill was due. Maria was 34 years old but felt 50. She worked 3 jobs cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during lunch shifts, and helping her neighbor's daughter with tutoring in the evenings. Every dollar had a destination before she earned it, and still there was never quite enough. Her phone buzzed. Carmen, her neighbor and closest friend, was calling. Maria, have you heard? Heard what? Carmen, I don't have time for the Montgomery treasure. Everyone's talking about it at the community center. Mrs. Stevens heard from her cousin who cleans for a lawyer downtown that old Elias Montgomery left some kind of treasure map to his grandson. Hidden money, Maria. Somewhere in our neighborhood, the old quarter. Maria's first instinct was to dismiss it. Fairy tales were for people who could afford to dream. She dealt in reality's rent, food, keeping her children safe and healthy. But something in Carmen's voice caught her attention. The Montgomery family name carried weight in this city. They owned half the real estate, funded museums and hospitals. If there really was hidden money, and if it was in the old quarter. Carmen, I have to go, Maria said quietly. Thank you for telling me. She hung up and stood very still in her tiny kitchen. For just a moment, she let herself imagine what finding a treasure might mean. Not mansions or luxury. Maria's dreams were smaller and more urgent. A savings account, a safety net, the ability to say yes when her children asked for something, without calculating whether it meant they couldn't afford something else. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Hope was dangerous when you lived on the edge. Hope could make you foolish, make you take risks you couldn't afford. But what if? Maria made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go to the Spring Hill Community Festival. She would ask questions, listen to rumors, and maybe find out if there was any truth to this story. Not because she expected to find treasure, but because she'd learned long ago that sometimes the only difference between surviving and drowning was being willing to reach for an unexpected lifeline. Neither Richard nor Maria knew it yet, but their lives were about to intersect in ways that would change them both forever. The treasure hunt was beginning, though the treasure they would find was nothing like either of them imagined. The assembly, the Spring Hill Community Festival, transformed the neighborhood park into a collision of worlds. Food trucks sold gourmet tacos next to homemade tamales from folding tables. Children from the wealthy West Side played soccer with kids from the Old Quarter. For one afternoon, the invisible lines that divided the city blurred just enough to create possibility. Richard Montgomery walked through the festival feeling completely out of place. He wore khakis and a polo shirt, his attempt at casual, but still looked like a man who'd wandered out of a country club. He'd brought the journal, hoping somehow that being in the neighborhood his grandfather had written about might offer clarity. The riddles remained opaque. Where the river bends twice. Shadows of the stone. He needed help, but he had no idea where to start. He'd spent the morning researching online, but the city's historical records were incomplete. The Old Quarter had changed so much since 1952 that trying to match his grandfather's clues to current geography felt impossible. Richard was a man who solved problems with money and connections. But this puzzle required something else entirely: local knowledge, oral history. The kind of information that lived in communities rather than databases. He was standing near a community bulletin board, pretending to read announcements about ESL classes and food banks, when a soccer ball bounced off his leg. "Sorry, mister?" A young boy, maybe 7 years old, came running up with an apologetic smile. "Can I have my ball back?" Richard bent down and picked it up, surprised by the boy's easy friendliness. "Of course. You've got a good kick there, Miguel," a woman's voice called out. And Richard looked up to see her approaching quickly. "What did I tell you about bothering people?" The woman Maria, though Richard didn't know her name, yet stopped short when she got close enough to see his face clearly. There was a moment of recognition. Not of each other but of something familiar in their expressions. They were both searching for something. "I'm so sorry," Maria said, taking Miguel's hand. "He gets excited and forgets his manners." "No harm done," Richard said, and then, compelled by something he couldn't quite name, "Your son has good energy. You should be proud." Maria's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. I am." She paused, studying him. "You're Richard Montgomery." It wasn't a question. Richard felt a familiar discomfort at being recognized. "Do we know each other?" "No, but I've seen your picture. Business section of the paper." "You are." She trailed off, and Richard could see her making a decision about whether to continue. "You're looking for it, aren't you? Your grandfather's treasure." Richard stiffened immediately. "How do you know about that?" Maria gave a short, bitter laugh. "Word travels fast in neighborhoods like mine, Mr. Montgomery. A story about hidden money? People pay attention to that kind of thing." "And you are?" "Maria Reyes. I live in the Old Quarter. Born there, raised there, probably die there too." She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. "Look, I don't mean to intrude. Good luck with your search." She started to turn away, pulling Miguel with her, but Richard surprised himself by speaking up. "Wait." Maria stopped and looked back at him, wary. Richard took a breath, swallowing his pride. "Ms. Reyes, I could use some help. My grandfather's journal mentions places in the Old Quarter. But the city has changed so much since he wrote it. I don't know the neighborhood. I don't know its history. And he specifically wrote that I shouldn't do this alone. Why would I help you? Maria asked directly. No offense, but you don't need money. Whatever treasure there is, it'll just make a rich man richer. You're right, Richard admitted, and saw surprise flicker across Maria's face at his honesty. I don't need money, but I need purpose. My grandfather left me this puzzle for a reason. And I think solving it might help me understand something I've been missing. And as for the treasure, if we find anything, we split it. 50-50. You have the knowledge I need. I have resources that might help us search. It's a partnership, not charity. Maria studied him for a long moment. Miguel tugged at her hand impatiently, but she held up a finger to quiet him. Why should I trust you? She finally asked. Because I'm asking for help, Richard said simply. In my world, people don't do that very often. We hire consultants and contractors and keep everyone at arm's length. But my grandfather wrote, "Do not travel alone," and I think he meant it. I think this whole thing is a lesson I'm supposed to learn. And I can't learn it by myself. Maria considered this. She thought about her children, about the risks and possibilities. This man could be lying. He could take whatever they found and leave her with nothing. But she'd learned to read people in her years of service work. Watching how they treated waitstaff and cleaning crews. And something in Richard Montgomery's eyes looked genuine. He looked lost. She understood lost. I have conditions, she said. Name them. First, we do this on my schedule. I have 2 kids and 3 jobs. I can't drop everything to run around the city hunting treasure. Second, whatever we find, if we find anything, part of it goes to helping families in the old quarter. Real help, not just charity that makes rich people feel good. And third, she paused, making sure he was listening. You treat me like an equal partner. Not like the help. Not like someone you're doing a favor. Equal. Can you do that? Richard extended his hand. I can try. And if I slip up, I trust you'll call me on it. Maria shook his hand, and felt calluses from his work. Meat calluses from hers, different kinds of labor, but both real. All right then, she said. Partners. When do we start? How about right now? I have the journal in my car. We could grab coffee and start looking at the clues. Maria glanced at Miguel, then back at Richard. I need to drop my son at my friend's house. There's a coffee shop on Moreno Street, Las Hermanas. Meet me there in 30 minutes. And Mr. Montgomery? The coffee is $2, not $7. We're in my neighborhood now. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that surprised them both. I'll see you there. And please, call me Richard. As Maria walked away with Miguel, Richard felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt anticipation instead of emptiness. He was about to embark on an adventure with a complete stranger. Someone from a world he'd spent his whole life insulated from. It was uncomfortable and uncertain. It felt exactly right. Part 3: The Journey Over Coffee at Las Hermanas, where Richard learned that a $2 cup could taste better than the $7 ones he usually bought. They spread out the journal and began to work. Maria proved invaluable immediately. When Richard read the clue about where the river bends. Twice, she corrected him. Not twice. 4 times. There are 4 bends, though only 3 are on official maps anymore. 4? El Codo, the elbow. It's an old bend that got covered over when they built the highway overpass in the 60s. My grandmother used to tell stories about fishing there as a girl. The river doesn't flow there anymore, but the bend is still there, underground. Richard stared at her, impressed. How do you know this? Maria shrugged. I listen. Old people in the neighborhood, they have memories. They tell stories. You just have to care enough to hear them. They worked through the afternoon with Maria, providing context for each of Richard's grandfather's cryptic phrases. Shadows of the stone, could refer to the old bridge pylons, or possibly the cemetery where early industrialists were buried. Where angels weep was almost certainly Saint Sebastian's cemetery. There was a famous statue there called the Weeping Angel. We should start there, Maria suggested. The cemetery. It's open until sunset. They drove to Saint Sebastian's in Richard's car, a luxury sedan that made Maria profoundly uncomfortable until Richard noticed and said, "It's just a car. Expensive, yes, but still just a machine that gets us from one place to another. Tell me about the cemetery." As they walked through the iron gates, Maria's demeanor changed. She became quieter, more reflective. "My mother is buried here," she said finally. "I haven't visited in 2 years. Couldn't afford the flowers, didn't want to come empty-handed." "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. "Don't be. She had a hard life but a good heart. She taught me that wealth and worth are different things." Maria paused by a modest headstone. "Hi, Mama. I'm sorry I haven't been by. I brought someone with me today. We're on an adventure. I think you'd like that." Richard felt a lump in his throat watching this moment. He thought about his own grandfather's grave, which he'd visited exactly once, for the funeral. He'd brought expensive flowers and stayed for 5 minutes, treating it like a business obligation rather than an opportunity to connect with memory. They found the Weeping Angel statue in the merchants section of the cemetery, an area where early 20th century business owners had erected impressive monuments to themselves. The angel was carved from white marble, weathered by decades but still beautiful, forever frozen in an expression of sorrowful compassion. "There," Maria pointed, an inscription at the base. Richard knelt down and read, "Wealth gathered quickly dwindles, but wealth gathered little by little grows." Proverbs chapter 1311. "It's a Bible verse," Maria said. "My mother used to quote it when I was impatient about wanting things we couldn't afford." "My grandfather was sending a message," Richard said slowly. "Even then, in 1952, he was thinking about what wealth really means." They examined the statue more carefully and found a date carved discreetly into the base, April 15, 1952. The same year from the journal entry. "There has to be something here," Richard said, running his hands around the statue's foundation. Maria joined him, and together, they discovered that one of the base stones was slightly loose. With careful work, they managed to shift it, revealing a small metal box cemented into a hollow space. Richard's hands shook as he pulled it free. Inside were more papers, another letter from his grandfather, and a new set of clues. He read aloud, "To my grandson, if you are reading this, I hope you have not traveled alone. The greatest wealth I ever possessed was not found in my bank accounts, but in the friends who journeyed with me when I had nothing. The final clue awaits where I first learned this truth, where charity begins." Maria thought for a moment. Where charity begins. Your grandfather funded a soup kitchen in the old quarter back in the 40s. The Henderson Street Mission. It closed down 20 years ago, but the building is still there. How do you know that? I walk past it every day on my way to work, Maria said simply. I've always wondered about it. There's a faded sign that says, "The heart of gold beats here." I used to make up stories about what it meant when I was a kid. They made plans to meet the next day at the old mission building. As they walked back to the car, Richard said, "Thank you for sharing that moment with your mother. I know that was personal." Maria smiled. "You're welcome. And Richard? Thank you for not treating this like a transaction. You could have just hired someone to help you, kept it all business. But you're actually trying to understand what your grandfather wanted you to learn. I'm starting to think what he wanted me to learn wasn't about finding treasure at all," Richard admitted. "I think he wanted me to learn how to be human again." The next evening, they met at the Henderson Street Mission, just as the sun was setting. The building was in disrepair, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling. "I remember this place," Maria said softly as they approached. "My mother brought me here once, when we had absolutely nothing. I must have been 6. They gave us a hot meal and a blanket. And I thought it was the most beautiful place in the world. To a hungry child, kindness looks like a palace. They found a way inside through a loose board." Richard turned on his flashlight, and the beam cut through darkness, thick with dust and memory. The main room was large, with a high ceiling, and remnants of long wooden tables where meals had been served. And there, on the far wall, partially hidden by grime and age, was a mural. "Look," Maria breathed. They moved closer. The mural depicted people of all backgrounds, rich and poor, old and young, gathered together around a golden hearth that radiated light. Beneath it, in faded letters, were the words, "The heart of gold beats in every act of kindness." "Behind it," Richard said, his voice tight with emotion. "There's something behind it." They carefully worked at the old plaster, and eventually revealed what had been hidden for decades. A safe, built into the wall itself. "Do you know the combination?" Maria asked. Richard thought about the clues, the dates, the journey. "April 15, 1952, he said, trying the numbers. The safe clicked. The door swung open. Inside were documents, official papers, deeds, bank statements. Richard pulled them out with trembling hands while Maria held the flashlight. "It's not money," Richard said, his voice strange. Maria, it's a foundation. The Elias Montgomery Foundation for Community Advancement." He read through the papers, his voice cracking with emotion. "Established in 1952 with an initial endowment of $2 million. Purpose to provide resources, education, and opportunity to families in need. With special emphasis on the Old Quarter and surrounding neighborhoods. $2 million in 1952, Maria whispered. That would be worth tens of millions today, Richard finished. If it's been properly managed." He flipped through more documents. "It has been. The accounts are still active. The foundation still exists. It just went dormant, forgotten." There was one more letter, sealed in an envelope with Richard's name written on it in his grandfather's handwriting. Richard opened it with shaking hands and read it aloud, his voice breaking. "My dearest Richard, the first fear I have failed you. I raised your father to value wealth above all else. And he has raised you the same way. By the time you read this, I will be gone. And I pray you will have learned what I learned too late, that money without purpose is a prison. And true wealth can only be measured by the lives we touch. I started this foundation in secret after nearly losing everything in 1950. I was saved by the kindness of strangers in the Old Quarter. People who had nothing but shared what they had anyway. They taught me that generosity isn't about having excess to give away, it's about recognizing our shared humanity regardless of circumstance. This foundation was my greatest achievement, but I hid it, hoping you would seek it out. Hoping the search itself would teach you what I could not. If you have found this, I pray you did not journey alone. I pray you met people who showed you, as I was shown, that the real treasure in life is not what we accumulate, but what we give away, and who we become in the giving. Do not spend this inheritance. Invest it in people, in hope, in second chances. That is the only treasure worth finding. Build bridges where I built walls. See people I overlooked. Live the lesson I learned too late. With all my love and all my hope, your grandfather, Elias." The silence that followed was profound. Maria had tears streaming down her face. Richard sat down heavily on the dusty floor, overwhelmed. He set up this entire treasure hunt. Richard finally said, "Not to give me money, but to teach me how to live." Maria sat down next to him. "He loved you very much. I've been so empty," Richard confessed, the words pouring out now. "So successful and so hollow. I thought when I retired, I'd feel fulfilled. Instead, I just felt obsolete. Like I'd spent 40 years building nothing that mattered. I have a beautiful apartment that feels like a tomb. I have a calendar full of nothing. I have everything and I have nothing. You matter, Richard, Maria said gently. You're here. You found this. You can do something with it. Richard corrected, looking at her. We can do something with it. You're still my partner in this. 50-50, remember? Maria laughed through her tears. I don't need millions of dollars, Richard. I need to know my kids will be okay. That they'll have chances I didn't have. That there's a safety net when things go wrong. That I'm not alone in this fight. Then let's make sure no parent in this neighborhood ever feels alone again, Richard said quietly. Let's activate this foundation. Let's make it everything my grandfather dreamed of. Scholarship programs, job training, affordable childcare, emergency assistance, mentorship. Everything you wish existed when you needed it most. Do you know how many lives that could change? Maria asked, her voice full of wonder. I'm starting to, Richard said. But I can't do it without you. You know this community. You know what people need. I have the business experience to make it sustainable. Together we could actually make a difference, Maria finished. They sat in that dusty, abandoned mission building. Two people from completely different worlds, united by a dead man's wisdom and a shared revelation. The treasure hunt had led them not to gold or jewels, but to something far more valuable: purpose, partnership, and the possibility of creating meaning from their lives. Outside, the sun had fully set, but inside, in that forgotten space, where kindness had once been freely given, a new light was beginning to shine. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Richard and Maria met almost daily, poring over the foundation documents, consulting with lawyers, and developing plans. What began as a treasure hunt transformed into something neither of them had anticipated: a genuine friendship. Richard discovered that Maria had a sharp mind for organization, and an intuitive understanding of what struggling families needed. She'd lived the problems they were trying to solve, which gave her insights no consultant could provide. When he suggested certain programs, she'd gently point out why they wouldn't work. Practice, then offer better alternatives. We can't just offer job training, she explained one afternoon in Richard's apartment. The first time she'd visited, and she'd been intimidated by the opulence until Richard admitted he rarely used most of the rooms. People need childcare while they're training. They need transportation. They need someone to believe in them when they've had nothing but doors slammed in their faces. Maria, meanwhile, learned that Richard's business acumen was more than just making money. It was about creating sustainable systems. He taught her how to think about long-term impact, how to structure programs so they wouldn't just help people once but create cycles of improvement. Think of it like compound interest, he explained, using terms from his old world to illuminate their new one. Every person we help has the potential to help others. Every child who gets an education can lift their whole family. We're not just providing charity, we're investing in human potential. As they worked, they both changed. Richard started spending less time in isolation, and more time in the old quarter. Maria introduced him to neighbors, shop owners, families struggling to get by. He learned names, heard stories, began to see the neighborhood not as a place on a map, but as a community of real people with dreams and dignity. One evening, Maria brought Sophia and Miguel to meet Richard. The children were shy at first, intimidated by his wealth, and uncertain of this man who had entered their mother's life. "Do you live in a castle?" Miguel asked seriously. Richard laughed. "No, just an apartment. A very big, very empty apartment. Would you like to see it?" The children explored with wide eyes, but Sophia, the more perceptive of the two, eventually came back to Richard and asked, "Why don't you have any pictures?" Richard looked around his apartment and realized she was right. The walls were decorated with expensive art. But there were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing that indicated a life actually lived there. I suppose I never thought I had anything worth photographing, he admitted. That's sad, Sophia said with the brutal honesty of children. Then, pulling out her phone, she added, we should take one now. Mama says your family now. That photograph Richard with Maria, Sophia, and Miguel. All of them laughing at something Miguel had said. Became the first personal picture Richard had displayed in his home in over a decade. He put it in a frame on his desk, where he'd see it every day. Maria changed too. With Richard's help, she was able to cut back to 2 jobs instead of 3. Which gave her more time with her children. But more than that, she discovered a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. She'd always been smart and capable, but poverty had taught her to make herself small. To not ask for too much, to be grateful for crumbs. Working with Richard, she learned to advocate not just for herself, but for her entire community. She learned that her voice mattered, that her experiences gave her expertise that was valuable. When Richard deferred to her judgment on community matters, she stopped being surprised and started trusting her own instincts. 6 months after finding the foundation documents, they were ready to launch. They decided to start by renovating the Henderson Street mission and turning it into a full community center. The grand reopening was planned as a celebration for the entire neighborhood. The night before the opening, Richard and Maria stood in the newly renovated building, walking through rooms that now housed a childcare center, computer lab, job training space, and community kitchen. My grandfather would have loved this, Richard said softly. I think he'd be proud of you, Maria replied. I think he'd be proud of us, Richard corrected. 6 months ago, I was a lonely old man waiting to die. You gave me a reason to live. You gave me hope, Maria countered. Not just for my kids, but for myself. You treated me like I mattered. You do matter. More than you know. They stood in comfortable silence, contemplating what they'd built together. Richard, Maria said finally, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Are you happy now? Richard considered the question seriously. I'm happier than I've been in decades. Maybe ever. I wake up with purpose. I go to bed tired but fulfilled. I have friends, real friends, not just business associates. I have. He gestured around the center. I have this. Something that matters. Good, Maria said simply. Because you deserve that. So do you. And so does everyone who's going to walk through these doors tomorrow. Maria smiled. Your grandfather was a wise man, leaving you that treasure hunt. He knew exactly what he was doing. He gave me the greatest gift anyone could give, Richard agreed. Not money, but the chance to discover what my life could be about. The chance to find meaning. And a friend, Maria added. And a friend, Richard echoed. The real treasure. They locked up the center and walked out into the warm evening. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, not just for the foundation, but for the entire community. But tonight, they were simply 2 people who had journeyed together and found something. Neither had expected a partnership built on mutual respect, a friendship forged through shared purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were making a difference. The treasure hunt was over. The real work was just beginning. And both of them couldn't wait. The grand reopening of the Henderson Street mission was more than Maria and Richard had dared to dream. The morning dawned clear and bright, with a line already forming outside before the official opening time. Families from across the old quarter came, along with representatives from city government, local business owners, and reporters from the community newspaper. The mayor sent a proclamation. I will like to interrupt and ask you to please like the video and subscribe. Local musicians volunteered to play. But what moved Richard most was seeing the faces of ordinary people, mothers with children, Elderly couples, young people looking for opportunities, all coming with hope in their eyes. Maria stood at the entrance, greeting people she'd known her whole life. Introducing them to Richard, who shook every hand and learned every name. He'd prepared a speech but abandoned it when the moment came, speaking instead from his heart. My grandfather, Elias Montgomery, founded a charity in 1952. That I only discovered 6 months ago. In hiding it, he gave me an unexpected gift, a treasure hunt that led me not to gold, but to understanding. He wanted me to learn what he spent his whole life learning, that wealth without purpose is meaningless. And that true richness can only be found in community, in compassion, and in the connections we build with one another. The crowd listened quietly, some nodding in recognition. I cannot take credit for this center, Richard continued. The vision belongs to my grandfather and to Maria Reyes, whose wisdom and lived experience shaped everything you see here. This place exists because we understood that helping people requires more than money, it requires humility, listening, and the courage to admit we need each other. I was lost before this journey. Maria helped me find my way. And together, I hope we've created something that will help others find their way too. When Maria took the microphone, her voice was steady despite her emotions. When I was 6 years old, my mother brought me to this building. We had nothing, no food, no hope, nowhere to turn. The people here gave us a meal and treated us with dignity. They didn't make us feel small. They made us feel human. That memory never left me. She paused, looking around at the renovated space. For 20 years, this building sat empty. A reminder of promises broken and help withdrawn. But today, it reopens with a new promise that no one in this community will face their struggles alone. That every person, regardless of their bank account, has worth and deserves opportunity. That poverty is not a moral failing but a circumstance we can change together. The applause was thunderous. After the speeches, they cut the ribbon. Together Maria, Richard, Sophia, and Miguel, each holding a corner of the ceremonial scissors. Cameras flashed. People cheered. And then the building opened, and families poured in to explore. Richard spent the day touring people through the facilities, explaining programs, and most importantly, listening. Every person had a story, and he realized that for years he'd insulated himself from these stories, treating them as statistics or problems to be solved, rather than as human experiences to be witnessed and honored. An elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez pulled him aside at one point. "I knew your grandfather," she said, her eyes sharp despite her age. "In 1950, he lost everything in a bad business deal. Came to our neighborhood with nothing. My mother ran a boarding house and gave him a room when he couldn't pay. He worked odd jobs, helped our neighbors, learned what it meant to struggle. When his fortune came back, he never forgot. He used to say that being poor was the best business school he ever attended, because it taught him what really mattered." "I didn't know that," Richard said, stunned. He kept it quiet. Didn't fit the image of a self-made man. But those of us who were there, we remembered. He was good people. I think he'd be real proud of you today, learning the same lessons. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you for telling me that." As evening approached and the crowds thinned, Richard found Maria in the community kitchen, helping clean up after the celebration. "You don't have to do that," he said. "We hired staff." "I know," Maria replied, continuing to wipe down counters. "But this is who I am. I don't stop being me just because circumstances changed." Richard picked up a towel and joined her. They worked in companionable silence for a while. "Are you going to quit your other jobs?" Richard finally asked. "I already did," Maria admitted. "Last week. It was scary, but I'm going to run this place, if you think I can." "If I think you can?" "Maria, you're the only person who can. This is your vision as much as mine. More, really. We'll co-direct then. Equal partners, remember? Equal partners, Richard agreed. Sophia and Miguel burst into the kitchen, excited from their day exploring the center. Mama, Mr. Richard, can we show you what we made in the art room? Sophia asked. They followed the children back to the art space, where both had created drawings. Sophia's showed the community center surrounded by people holding hands. Miguel's showed a treasure chest. But instead of gold inside, it was filled with hearts. These are perfect, Maria said, hugging them both. We'll hang them on the wall so everyone can see. Later, after the children had gone home with a neighbor, Richard and Maria stood on the front steps of the center, watching the sun set over the old quarter. Do you remember what your grandfather wrote? Maria asked. About how the greatest wealth he ever possessed was the friends who journeyed with him when he had nothing? I do. I understand that now. 6 months ago, I had nothing. I still don't have much, materially. But I have purpose. I have hope. I have friends. I have. She gestured at the center. I have this. And I feel richer than I ever have. So do I, Richard said quietly. My grandfather spent years trying to tell my father. And then me, that money isn't the goal, it's just a tool. We never listened. But he found a way to make me learn it anyway, by turning it into a quest. Forcing me to journey, to meet people outside my bubble. To discover what really matters. What do you think he'd say if he could see us now? Richard smiled. I think he'd say the treasure hunt isn't over. That every day is a new clue, every person we help is a new discovery. And the real gold is in the connections we make and the lives we touch along the way. Maria nodded. My grandmother used to say something similar. El oro pesa en el bolsillo pero la bondad levanta el alma. Gold weighs down the pocket, but kindness lifts the soul. Your grandmother was wise. She was poor her whole life, Maria said. But she was the richest person I ever knew. She always had time for people, always had something to share. Even when she had almost nothing. When she died, hundreds of people came to her funeral. People she'd helped, people she'd encouraged, people whose lives she'd touched. That's wealth. Richard was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own funeral someday. 6 months ago, it would have been lawyers and business associates. People attending out of obligation or hoping to network. Now? He looked at Maria, thought about Sophia and Miguel, about Mrs. Rodriguez. And the dozens of people he'd met today who'd thanked him not for his money, but for seeing them, for caring, for being present. I wasted so much time, he said softly. No, Maria countered firmly. You're here now. That's what matters. My mother used to tell me that regret is just fear wearing a different mask. The question isn't what we did yesterday, it's what we're going to do tomorrow. Wise women seem to run in your family. They survived. Survival requires wisdom. They sat on the steps in comfortable silence. As the neighborhood settled into evening, lights came on in windows. Families gathered for dinner. Life continued in its ordinary, sacred way. Richard, Maria said after a while, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking about compound interest, he said with a slight smile. But not the financial kind. I'm thinking about how every person we help today has the potential to help someone else tomorrow. How Sophia and Miguel, growing up with more opportunities than you had, might become doctors or teachers or entrepreneurs who lift up others. How Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren, if they use the computer lab to learn new skills, might create businesses that employ people from this neighborhood. How small acts of kindness multiply over time into something exponential. That's beautiful, Maria said. And you explaining hope through mathematics. Richard laughed. I suppose old habits die hard. But Maria, I want you to understand something. When I found that journal 6 months ago, I was contemplating whether my life had any meaning at all. I'd achieved everything I was supposed to achieve and felt completely empty. I was going through the motions of living but not actually alive. And now? Now I wake up excited. Now I have reasons to get out of bed. He paused, searching for words. Now I matter, not because of my bank account, but because I'm connected to something larger than myself. I'm connected to you, to this community, to a purpose that will outlive me. My grandfather didn't just give me a foundation, he gave me a life. And I have you to thank for helping me see that. You would have figured it out eventually, Maria said. I don't think so. I needed a guide. Someone who understood what I didn't, who could translate between my world and the real world. You were patient with me when I said ignorant things. You challenged me when I tried to solve problems with money instead of wisdom. You trusted me when you had every reason not to. You made me better. Maria felt tears welling up. You made me better too. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You treated my ideas like they mattered. You gave me confidence to claim space in rooms where I'd always felt like I didn't belong. You saw past my circumstances to who I actually am. Who you've always been, Richard corrected. I just had the privilege of witnessing it. They sat together as darkness. Fully settled, two people who had become far more than business partners. They'd become true friends, the kind of friendship that transcends social class and economic status, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the profound experience of journeying together towards something meaningful. A young mother walked by, holding her daughter's hand. She paused when she saw them. Ms. Maria? Mr. Richard? I just wanted to say thank you. I signed up for the job training program today. I've been stuck in dead-end work for years, and now I have hope. Thank you for giving me a chance. After she walked away, Maria turned to Richard, with tears streaming down her face. That's why, she said simply. That's why we do this. That's the treasure, Richard agreed. 3 months later, the Henderson Street Mission Community Center was thriving beyond their initial expectations. The computer lab was booked solid with people learning digital skills. The job training program had placed 17 people in new careers. The childcare center had a waiting list. The community kitchen served meals to anyone who needed them. No questions asked, no shame attached. But more than the programs, something else was happening. The center had become a genuine gathering place, breaking down barriers between different neighborhoods. People who would never have met were forming friendships, sharing skills, supporting each other's dreams. Richard had moved out of his penthouse and into a modest apartment in the old quarter. It wasn't a statement or a sacrifice, it was a choice. He wanted to be part of the community, not just a benefactor observing from a distance. His new apartment had pictures on the walls. Now photos of the center's opening, of Maria and her children, of community events and celebrations. His calendar was full, but with meaningful engagements rather than empty obligations. Maria had enrolled in college courses online, working toward a degree in social work. She discovered she loved learning and had a gift for understanding systems and policies. Richard encouraged her, offering to fund her education. But she insisted on taking out student loans. I need to do this myself, she explained. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to prove to myself that I can. My whole life, people told me college wasn't for people like me. I need to prove them wrong. Richard understood. Pride and dignity mattered, sometimes more than practical efficiency. One evening, they sat in Richard's new apartment, smaller than his old one but warmer. Moore lived in reviewing applications for the Foundation's first college scholarship program. Look at this one, Maria said, passing Richard an application. Single mother of 2, working full-time, wants to become a nurse. She reminds me of myself 5 years ago. Then she's exactly who we should support, Richard said. Full scholarship, plus stipend for childcare and expenses. Let's make sure money isn't the barrier between her and her dream. Just like that? Maria asked. Just like that. That's why the foundation exists. My grandfather didn't hoard his wealth until death. He used it while he was alive to create opportunities. We're just continuing what he started. Maria looked at the application again, imagining the phone call they'd make, the moment this woman's life would change. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if your grandfather hadn't left you that journal? Every day, Richard admitted. I'd probably still be sitting in that penthouse, watching time pass, waiting to die, wealthy and miserable and alone. The journal saved my life. No, Maria corrected. Your willingness to follow it saved your life. You could have just handed the journal to a lawyer or a private investigator. You could have solved the puzzle without getting your hands dirty. But you didn't. You chose to take the journey yourself. Because he told me not to travel alone. That was the whole point. He knew I needed to connect with people, needed to see beyond my limited world. He was forcing me to be uncomfortable, to ask for help, to be vulnerable. It worked. It did. Though I'll admit, that first day at the festival, I almost didn't approach you. I was terrified. Maria laughed. You? Terrified? Of me? Of rejection? Of looking foolish? Of admitting I needed help from someone I'd never met? I'd spent my whole life being the expert, the one with answers. Asking for help felt like admitting weakness. Asking for help is strength, Maria said. That's another thing my grandmother taught me. She said pride is expensive. It costs you opportunities, relationships, growth. Humility is free and opens doors. Your grandmother should have written a book. She couldn't read or write, Maria said. But she lived her wisdom. That's better than any book. They continued reviewing applications in comfortable silence, occasionally discussing a particularly compelling case or debating priorities. This had become their rhythm, working together, challenging each other, building something larger than either of them alone could create. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Rodriguez. My grandson just got accepted to college. First in our family. The tutoring program at the center helped him so much. Thank you for giving him a chance. He showed the text to Maria, who smiled through sudden tears. That's 3 generations, she said softly. Mrs. Rodriguez helped your grandfather when he had nothing. We created a center that helped her grandson. Who knows who he'll help someday? Compound interest, Richard said. Human compound interest. The best kind. A year after the treasure hunt began, Richard and Maria stood once again in front of the weeping angel statue, where they'd found the first clue. They'd brought flowers for the angel, for the memory of Richard's grandfather, and for Maria's mother, whose grave was nearby. I come here more often now, Maria said, kneeling by her mother's headstone. I can afford flowers. But more than that, I want to tell her what's happening, what we're doing. I think she'd be proud. I know she would, Richard said. Hi, Mama, Maria said softly to the grave. It's been a good year. The kids are doing well. Sophia made honor roll. And Miguel joined the soccer team at the center. I'm taking college classes. Can you believe it? Your daughter, in college. And I met someone you would have liked. His name is Richard, and he's become family. We're helping people together, the way you always helped people. I wish you could meet him. Richard knelt beside Maria. Mrs. Reyes, I never had the privilege of meeting you. But your daughter tells me you were an extraordinary woman. I want you to know that she's changed my life. She taught me what your grandmother taught her. What you taught her, that wealth isn't about money, it's about generosity of spirit. Thank you for raising such a remarkable daughter. I promise to honor her wisdom and support her dreams, the way you would have wanted. They stood up, brushing off their knees, and walked together toward Elias Montgomery's grave, which Richard hadn't visited since the funeral. The headstone was simple, elegant, Elias Montgomery, 1920 to 2025. He learned that giving was the only getting worth doing. I chose that epitaph, Richard said. After reading his letters, it seemed fitting. It's perfect. Grandfather, Richard said aloud, I found your treasure. It took me on quite a journey. I met Maria, who became my partner and friend. We've activated your foundation and expanded your vision. The Henderson Street mission is open again, serving hundreds of people. We've helped people find jobs, get education, support their families. But more than that, you taught me what you were trying to teach my father and me. All along, that purpose matters more than profit. That connections matter more than collections, that the best investment is in human potential. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. I wish I'd understood while you were alive. I wish I'd taken time to really know you, to hear your stories, to learn from your experiences. But I'm grateful for the lesson you left behind. You gave me a second chance at life, and I'm not wasting it. Thank you, grandfather. I love you, and I'm trying to make you proud. Maria squeezed his hand. They walked back toward the cemetery gates in the golden late afternoon light. The city stretched out before them, complex and beautiful, full of problems and possibilities. What's next? Maria asked. What do you mean? The foundation is established. The center is run. We've helped hundreds of people. What's the next adventure? Richard smiled. I've been thinking about that. What if we expanded? Not just one center, but 3 or 5. What if we took your grandmother's wisdom, your mother's kindness, my grandfather's vision, and multiplied it across the whole city? What if we created a model that other cities could replicate? That's ambitious. So was finding a treasure based on 70-year-old clues. We did that together. Why not this? Maria's eyes lit up with excitement. A network of community centers, each one tailored to its neighborhood but sharing resources and best practices. Job training, childcare, education, healthcare, and legal aid, everything people need to thrive, not just survive. Exactly. And we train people from each community to run them. Not swooping in with outsiders, but empowering locals who understand their neighborhoods. That could change thousands of lives. Tens of thousands, eventually. Maybe more. They reached Maria's car, a reliable used sedan. Richard had helped her purchase when her old one finally died. She'd insisted on paying him back through the foundation salary she now earned. You know what I love about us? Maria said as they got in. What? 6 months ago, you would have said that could change thousands of people's lives. Now you say, lives. Like you see them as real individuals, not statistics. You taught me that. Every person has a name, a story, dreams that matter. They're not problems to solve, they're human beings deserving of dignity and opportunity. And you taught me that I deserve to dream big. That my ideas matter, that poverty doesn't define my worth. They drove through the old quarter as evening settled in. Lights glowed in windows. Families gathered for dinner. Life in all its ordinary, sacred beauty continued. Richard, Maria said as they pulled up to his apartment. Do you think your grandfather knew? When he created that treasure hunt. Do you think he knew we'd become family? I think he hoped, Richard said. I think he hoped I'd find someone who would teach me what he couldn't. How to live with purpose. How to value people over profit, how to build a life that matters. He couldn't have known it would be you specifically, but he knew if I followed his clues, I'd have to leave my isolated world and connect with real people. Real struggles, real humanity. He was brilliant. He was. And patient. He waited years after his death for me to find that journal, trusting that eventually I'd be ready to learn. Maria turned off the car. You want to grab dinner? There's a new taqueria on Moreno Street. The owner trained in the center's kitchen program. I'd love that. Let me buy. We split it, Maria interrupted. Equal partners, remember? Equal partners, Richard agreed, smiling. They walked down the street together, 2 people who had started as strangers from opposite worlds and become something far more meaningful: friends, partners, family. The treasure hunt had ended, but the real treasure, the connection they'd forged, the purpose they'd discovered, the lives they were touching continued to grow with each passing day. Behind them, the sun set over the old quarter, painting the sky in shades of gold. And in that golden light, two worlds that should never have touched were forever intertwined, proving that the greatest treasures are never buried in the ground but hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to journey together. The heart of gold had been beating all along. They'd simply learned to hear it. Epilogue. 5 years later, Richard Montgomery stood on a stage, accepting a humanitarian award he didn't want and certainly didn't feel he deserved. The foundation now operated 7 community centers across 3 cities, serving over 10,000 families annually. But Richard barely mentioned the statistics in his speech. Instead, he told a story. 5 years ago, he said to the audience of philanthropists and nonprofit leaders, "I was given a treasure map by my late grandfather. I thought I was searching for money. Instead, I found meaning. I thought I was on a quest to discover something hidden. Instead, I discovered parts of myself I didn't know existed." He paused, finding Maria in the audience. She sat with Sophia and Miguel, now teenagers, both thriving scholars at private schools. The foundation had helped them access. Maria herself had earned her degree and was now the foundation's director of community engagement, traveling the country to help other organizations implement their model. "The real treasure," Richard continued, "wasn't what I found but who I found it with. My partner, Maria Reyes, taught me that wealth without wisdom is worthless, that privilege without purpose is prison, and that the only way to truly live is to give yourself fully to something larger than yourself." After the ceremony, reporters clustered around, asking questions about the foundation's success, replication strategy, and funding model. Richard answered patiently but kept searching the crowd until he found Maria. "Can we get out of here?" he asked. "Absolutely." They slipped out a side exit and walked through the city streets, leaving the formal event behind for something more real. "You gave a good speech," Maria said. "I meant every word. You changed my life. We changed each other's lives. That's what partnership means." They walked in silence for a while, finally stopping at a small park near where they'd first met at the Spring Hill Festival all those years ago. "Do you remember when we sat on those steps at the center?" Maria asked. "And you talked about compound interest? About how helping one person creates ripples that spread outward?" "I do. I've been thinking about that. About your grandfather helping my grandmother's community in the 1950s. About my mother being helped by the original Henderson Street mission. About us finding the foundation and helping my children. About Sophia wanting to become a doctor now, so she can serve underserved communities. About Miguel wanting to be a teacher. About Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson who just opened a business that employs 20 people. From the old quarter. 75 years of compound interest," Richard said softly. "From my grandfather's first act of generosity to now. Countless lives touched, improved, transformed. And it all started because he was humble enough to accept help when he had nothing. And because you were brave enough to follow his clues. And because you were generous enough to help a stranger who desperately needed guidance." Maria smiled. "I think about that day sometimes. If I hadn't been at that festival. If I'd said no when you asked for help. If I'd let my pride or fear keep me from taking a chance. But you didn't. And neither did I. We both chose to be open to possibility. The treasure chose us as much as we chose it." They sat on a bench, watching the sun set over the city. A sight they never tired of. A ritual they'd shared hundreds of times over the years. "Richard, can I tell you something?" Maria asked. "Always. When I was young and struggling, I used to fantasize about finding treasure. Literal treasure, a chest of gold or winning the lottery. I thought money would solve everything. And maybe some problems would have been easier with money. But I wouldn't trade the journey we took for any amount of gold. Because the journey made me who I am. It gave me confidence, purpose, education, meaningful work. It gave me you as a friend. It gave my children a future I couldn't have provided alone. The struggle mattered. The searching mattered. The partnership mattered. I understand completely, Richard said. If my grandfather had just left me a check with a note saying, "Use this for charity," I would have written some donations and felt virtuously philanthropic for a day. But he made me work for it. He made me journey. He made me confront my own emptiness and privilege. He made me need help from someone I would never have met otherwise. The treasure hunt wasn't about the destination, it was about transformation. He really did love you, you know. To care that much about who you'd become. The greatest gift a grandparent can give, not wealth but wisdom. Not things but truth. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. And the city lights began to glow. Somewhere in those lights were families. The foundation had helped. Children who now had opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Parents who could breathe a little easier knowing support existed when they needed it. "What are you thinking about?" Maria asked. "I'm thinking that I'm 67 years old now. And the last 5 years have been the most meaningful of my life. I'm thinking that if I'd never found that journal, I might have lived another 20 years in that penthouse, comfortable and miserable and alone. I'm thinking that true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with purpose. Connection, and the knowledge that your life mattered. It matters," Maria said firmly. "You matter. Not because of what you've given away but because of who you've become." "We've become," Richard corrected. "Yes, we've become." Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Each one a point of light in the darkness, individually. Small but collectively magnificent. Like acts of kindness. Like lives touched. Like the compound interest of generosity spreading across time. "The heart of gold," Richard said. Softly, quoting the mural from the Henderson Street Mission, "beats in every act of kindness. And in every friendship," Maria added. "And in every person who chooses compassion over indifference. And in every moment we choose to see each other's humanity." They sat together until full darkness fell, two people who had traveled an unlikely journey and found an unexpected treasure not buried in the ground, but growing between them, in the space where two different worlds chose to meet, to learn from each other, and to build something beautiful together. The treasure hunt had ended years ago. But the treasure itself, purpose, partnership, and the transformative power of human connection would last the rest of their lives and ripple outward long after they were gone. Touching lives they would never meet, solving problems they would never see, creating hope in darkness they would never witness. Just as Richard's grandfather had hoped. Just as Maria's grandmother had taught. Just as every act of genuine kindness does. When given freely and received with gratitude. The shadows of the stone had revealed the heart of gold. And the heart of gold beat on, eternal and true. Waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to journey. Humble enough to ask for help, and open enough to be transformed by the search. The end. Please subscribe, like the video and comment.